Chapter 3, Monday, 12:40 p.m. Visitors. Clothes stiff with dried sweat, dirt, and cow shit, I opened the kitchen door from the garage. I stretched an arm around to pull a cold beer from the refrigerator without stepping inside. The doorbell rang, catching me hanging onto the door jamb with one hand, the other firmly wrapped around a cold bottle. It rang again as I debated whether to remove my crap-covered boots or clomp the 5 steps to the front door. Usually, I sat on the garage step to the kitchen. 2 beers later, all my clothes would be in the old washer in the garage, and I was under a hot shower with the 3rd cold beer. It's a system. The doorbell rang again. This time, the ringer was held down forever. Showing up naked to confront a compulsive doorbell ringer is never good. I debated going back into the garage, lifting up that heavy old squeaky door, and stepping into the St. Louis noon sauna. That sounded even worse. As I weighed my options, I finished the bottle, feeling the icy chill working its way to my head. I was reaching inside for another when the door-ringing asshole somehow realized my door ringer was an antique and held their finger down on the button. I took a long swallow before walking my cool inside, filthy on the outside body 5 steps across my kitchen to my front door. Just on principle, I stopped and finished the bottle at the door. Since the floor was already dirty, I shrugged and headed for a fresh one. A fist pounding on the door was added to the ringing. Pivoting, I opened the door wide to give the door slam shut maximum effect. I stopped my arm just in time. The relentless ringer was a woman. She stepped back, waving her hand and blinking her dark lashes to ward off my stench. Pulling my eyes from her high cheekbones, straight black hair, and full mouth, I looked over her head to the street. "Are you Mr. Lerner?" she asked. "No," I replied. A large black SUV sat at the curb. I wasn't into drugs, and the local gangbangers left me alone. Besides, the gangbangers didn't dress in slim business casual beige slacks, open-necked white dress shirts, and silk blazers. So she was a Fed, probably a Marshal, but possibly FBI. Supposedly, with Homeland Security, it didn't matter anymore. Looking into her dark eyes didn't answer the question, so my eyes traveled downward to look at her shoes. Marshals spend a lot of time on their feet and choose comfort over fashion. At the opening in her shirt, the eyes got sidetracked. It wasn't their fault. Their boss lacked class and let them roam free of political correctness. "Did you hear me? I'm Deputy Montoya. Are you high?" She whipped a wallet from somewhere lower than where my eyes were hopelessly stuck and thrust it in my face. It contained an official-looking badge surrounded by unreadable writing, unless my head retreated, which it refused to do. I crossed my eyes, and she snapped the wallet shut, clipping the end of my nose hard. Rubbing my nose, I replied, "No." "Are you sure?" she snapped. "Yes. Not my fault, though. The doorbell wouldn't stop ringing." My eyes went to hers and got stuck again. I tried to decide if they were a deep brown interlaced with violet or dark cinnamon with swirls of deep purple. Faint speckles of dark blue darted in and out. "Mr. Lerner, we need to talk," she snapped. Something didn't make sense. I took a deep breath, yet there it was, unmistakable and impossible. The smell of her somehow cut through the acrid smell of me. It wasn't perfume, I was sure of that. It smelled of cool skin under a ceiling fan after a hot shower. I wondered if there was such a thing as delayed heat stroke. Maybe she wasn't even there. Cocking my head, I asked, "And you're who again?" She clenched her jaw, reached into a pocket, and handed me a card. She had lied. Her first name was not Deputy, but Riley. U.S. Deputy Marshal Riley Montoya. I smiled my thanks and asked, "Who's Mr. Lerner?" Her eyes fled from mine, desperately searching for a place to land, only to dart back to where they had just fled, my disfigured face. The heat from the open door was erasing my inner cool. I regretted not going back to the fridge before I opened the door. Spending all your free time by yourself tends to weaken impulse control. But at that moment, it wasn't so much impulse control as impulse management. One impulse pulled me towards the refrigerator, while another anchored me in a hot doorway, trying to remember the last time a beautiful woman stood there. The answer was never, at least not since I moved in. The Marshal Service had improved a lot. They still stuck to conservative suits, but her slim, curved version came with that open neckline instead of a tie. That neckline hooked hard and deep into my imagination, which was in full gear when a voice made U.S. Deputy Marshal Riley Montoya jump. "Riley, for Christ's sakes, this is Lerner. How many assholes do we have with a face like that? Hey, Lerner, how's it hanging? I see you're sticking with the Scarface look." "Works for a dead man," I replied. Deputy Marshal Larry Burns sauntered up, looking every inch a U.S. Marshal, just not from this century. He wore a short-brimmed Stetson cowboy hat tipped slightly forward. A black woven leather bolo tie with silver-tipped ends was strapped around the collar of a pearl-buttoned gray shirt. The polished cowboy boots were snakeskin. Raised in Wyoming, I appreciated fine clothes. Shaking his hand, I said, "Like the look." "Really?" "Yeah, it's completely justified." His eyes narrowed, and I kept my face as straight as it allowed. His mouth twitched, his tell for "nice shot, asshole." The twitch grew to a wry grin, and he said, "Lerner, say hello to my little friend, Deputy Marshal Riley Montoya." I wonder how he ignored the laser beams of anger from his upgraded partner's dark eyes. But old school Larry didn't notice, even though this woman packed a gun. Deputy Marshal Riley Montoya decided to check the street out and walked to the edge of the porch. "Still playing babysitter?" I asked Larry. I kept my eyes on Riley, watching her stiffen in anger as she turned back to us. Larry hid his smile by coughing into his hand. Carefully avoiding Riley's probing stare, he said, "I put all my witnesses on social media and retired. But hell, with the terrorists and the immigrant invasion all on top of the drug war, the service is swamped. And even with the coronavirus vaccines, everything takes more time than it used to. Begged me to come back as a contractor. Said I'd only do it if I could do it my way." "They're that desperate, huh?" "Shit, man, they went past desperate last year. Traded up on my partner, too," he said, nodding down at Riley. I shook my head and smiled. It was the same old Larry, dressed up as a cowboy. "What happened to Bob?" "He and Marie went to Kansas to live next to the grandkids. Man, I left you in a nice little neighborhood and a nice house. You could fit this dump inside that place. The hell are you thinking? You have a better chance of getting killed here than ever getting hit by Dragna." "Yeah, Larry, it was perfect." It hadn't been perfect. It was the burbs, after all. That said, it hadn't been as bad as I thought it would be either. Larry knew why I left. Most of it, anyway. Something in his eyes told me not to go there with his new boss. "Well, Larry, at least here no one cares what I do. They don't give a damn if I keep my vending machines and supplies in the garage, or that I leave most nights to stock my machines. No one worries that I might be some kind of psycho who hunts at night, and not a single one of them also had a day job at a golf course. They might mow their lawns, but not someone else's." I didn't mention that those weren't the worst rumors about me in my old neighborhood. My new neighbors were more open-minded about night work, and they loved the vending machine chips, cookies, and candy in my garage. Many of them also lived their lives in the late nights and pre-dawn mornings when my inventory, or stash as they called it, was irresistible. Eventually, I rented a storage unit to keep enough stock for my paying customers. Then I worked out an arrangement that allowed me to safely leave a desktop computer and a large monitor in the home. Maybe my little arrangement was why I was getting this visit. That I could handle, but I knew better. Besides, marshals are not cops. They are not interested in crimes. They are bodyguards and manhunters. The bodies they guard are criminals who toss their buddies under the bus to stay out of prison. WITSEC marshals try to keep them alive so they can testify. The criminals agree to give up their old ways, keep their heads down, and testify on demand. In return, they get a new life. How they live it after testifying is their problem. A fair number of them, skilled journeymen in fraud, burglary, truck hijacking, and murder for hire, go back to doing what they know. Witnesses can include the good citizens just doing their duty, but they are the exceptions. I had been the rarest type of witness, the living dead. Maybe they were here to protect me from Tom Horn. However, in my new neighborhood, you don't invite cops of any kind into your house for any reason. These two could get me into serious trouble. I stepped onto the front porch to stand in front of my door. I held back a smile as Larry stepped back, grimacing. The smell of sweat and manure doesn't bother real cowboys. Deputy Riley turned to survey the street, and Larry rolled his eyes in apology. She might as well have held out a sign. Seeing no hit men or hit women, Deputy Riley walked back to us and said, "Lucky for us, Larry remembered where you moved. It wasn't in any of our records." She glanced at the row house next door, just over an arm's reach away, and said, "Let's take this inside." I said, "I didn't invite you in." "Mr. Lerner, we're trying to protect you," she said quietly, glancing at the house porch next door, only a few feet away. I didn't know that I was still in protection. What's the point? Unless you're here to tell me that you've arrested Nikki. "No, Mr. Lerner, they're still building a case against Dragna," she hissed, and I leaned forward. She leaned back and tried to blink the smell away, which never made sense to me. "I don't give a damn about Dragna. Are you telling me that you're not going to prosecute Nikki?" Larry stepped past her and went nose to nose with me. Maybe deep inside he was a real cowboy. "Look, Dale, you damn well know that none of that's our call. It's Gibaldi's call, and here's a flash. The U.S. Attorney for the New York Eastern District doesn't give a rat's ass what we think. I've never met him, but I hear he's a real asshole. We're doing our job, and you're the one who moved to this shithole. Let us in. Now." I wanted him to try. I thought about it long enough to make sure we understood each other before making them squeeze by me. Especially Larry, because he was right. That neighborhood he left me in had good people. They tried to give me a chance, and did pretty well, considering my attitude and looks. It wasn't Larry's fault that I moved to a place where face scars from fights were not uncommon. But would it have hurt him to comment on how much better the inside of the place was than the outside? I'd spent the better part of a weekend repainting both rooms. The room we stood in was stuffed with a small couch, a coffee table, and a two-person kitchen table with one chair. The large graphics monitor and keyboard on the table left just enough room for a small plate. The tower computer fitted nicely under the table opposite the chair. The other room was my bedroom and bath. Riley asked, "How long have you lived here, Mr. Lerner?" 2 years, more or less. Looking at my bare walls, she said, "Well, I suppose it's easy to keep clean." "Yes, it is," I said, keeping the truth to myself. Gabriella had always magically turned any place we lived into a home. For a little while, I had tried to improve the place. Occasionally, I glimpsed something through a store window. If I stopped, Gabriella looked back at me in the reflection, shaking her head sadly. She didn't speak, even if I begged her to, so I had no idea what she wanted. Since I didn't know what she expected me to do, I ignored any store windows after a while, kept my eyes forward, and felt Gabriella's disapproval. Keeping reflective surfaces to a minimum in the house helped. I had tried very hard not to think about those kinds of things. My first guests in this house had already overstayed their welcome. "Larry, why are you here? It's a little complicated and may take some time. Just what in the hell is in your vending machines? Cow shit? You want to take a shower? Come on, man, I've been in larger closets. Damn, Dale, go take a shower, please." Riley nodded her agreement from the kitchen corner, where she retreated. I shrugged. Everyone loves flowers, but few care for the smell of what makes them grow. I work part-time at a golf course, but I can see how the smell of honest work might bother you, I said, and walked out the door to the garage to take my boots off. I didn't bother to add that taking care of golf courses had paid for a large chunk of my college, nor did I mention that I always thought it was the best job I ever had. And I resisted the urge to stick to my process and strip off all my sweat-caked clothes in the garage. When I returned in my sock feet, Larry kicked back on my couch, held his nose and motioned to my bedroom. Deputy Marshal Riley Montoya, obviously less trusting, had stepped back onto the front porch and seemed to ready herself in case I made a run for it. That bothered me. What did she know or think she knew? "You're letting in the hot air. If you want to stand outside, at least close the damn door," I said, as I walked across my gritty kitchen floor. It would only take half a minute to sweep it up, and I almost reached for the broom. Catching myself in time, I stalked the 4 steps to my bedroom, my stocking feet crunching on dirt. Angrily, I slapped the door shut behind me before removing my socks. After moving in, I replaced the water heater with one that let me take long, scalding showers. Something about this visit made me wonder if private showers were about to be a memory. I told myself to stop being paranoid, but just in case, I stayed in the shower until the water ran cold. I toweled off and wiped the steam from the mirror. Gabriella looked back at me over my shoulder. I strained to feel nipples against my back, fingers running lightly along my thighs, ringlets of her soft raven hair tumbling over my shoulder, and soft lips nibbling my neck. But of course, I felt nothing. Gabriella, I sighed, and as always, she did not speak. Yet her dark eyes pulled at mine as if she desperately wanted me to understand something. Her lips parted, and I stopped breathing. She said nothing. I just wanted to hear her voice one more time. I wanted it even more than what she needed to tell me. In truth, talking had never been our thing. There was little in my world she cared about, and less in hers that I understood. It hadn't mattered because, at the time, I had a best friend with whom I talked about everything. But I loved listening to Gabriella's rich, strong voice, the southern French accent punctuated with burbles, guttural sighs, and bubbles of soft exclamations. In my world, or what had been my world, people texted. They texted even when working on the same floor, in the same room, or sitting next to you at lunch. Eye contact was minimal, and the conversations were discordant, as thumbs danced over smartphones, carrying on discussions with other thumbs. Unless Gabriella was at the table. She was slender, not voluptuous, her face oval, without sunken hollows beneath her cheekbones. Her olive skin was smooth, and her long eyelashes were hers. She wore her long raven hair in a million different ways, yet she always looked like herself on a picnic or at a charity ball. In a group selfie, she was often not the one men's eyes were drawn to at first glance. She was the one their eyes returned to visit. She couldn't talk and text simultaneously because her body was in constant motion, hands gesturing, shoulders shrugging, eyes rolling, all to the music of a woman's voice coming from the body of a young girl. She talked and listened with her entire body. You were in her moment, or you were not. Text while talking to her, and you immediately ceased to exist. The woman looking over my shoulder was my Gabriella, the one I took on picnics in Central Park, to charity balls, and to bed. I had come to accept her stillness. After all, she was dead. What tore at me was the worry for me in her eyes. I had seen those dark eyes twinkle in amusement, lose focus while making love, and flash in angry disgust. But they never showed a hint of worry about anyone, including me. Was it because she knew I was running out of time? Did she know the truth? Gabriella, I'm sorry. If I can't find him, I'll make him find me. I'm so sorry. As always, she didn't answer. Feeling the darkness begin to close in, I shut my eyes and took long, slow breaths. Not yet, I told myself. When I opened them, Gabriella was gone. I knew my girl. I had ignored her. So I ceased to exist until she decided to bring me back to life. But the dead cannot restore life any more than I could bring my girl back to life. All I could bring her was peace. Maybe. A voice in my head said, "Remember the plan." "This wasn't in the fucking plan," I replied. I pushed the darkness into a corner, told it to stay, and found Larry sitting on my couch drinking from my only coffee cup. He was reading a magazine, his hat beside him taking up the rest of the couch, and his shiny cowboy boots propped up on my antique Kmart coffee table. Larry once told me that he spent more time reading papers and magazines on the job than anything else he did in his entire life. I never understood why he refused to read from tablets or his phone like a normal person. His short, curly hair had faded from red to ginger, but he still looked at the world with amusement from a pair of light blue eyes. Deputy Montoya sat at the kitchen table, her back to me, watching an old movie on my computer display. Just a couple of feet away, the couch was more comfortable, with a perfect view of the big monitor. Granted, she would have had to move Larry's hat. Instead, she sat at my table with her hands resting by my keyboard and mouse. I tried to keep my face neutral as my mind raced. How did I leave my computer? I told myself to calm down. The game was on and working. Not recognizing Riley, it went into old movie mode. But maybe she saw it before it saw her. I tried to remember how I had left things before I left for work. With no sleep, I might have gotten careless. "Brother, you know I'd forgotten how good percolated coffee tastes. Heard you talking. Anyone I know?" Larry asked, peering at me over the top of his magazine. "Yeah, they said to say hi," I said, and tried to decide whether to sit with Larry on the couch or join his partner at the small table. I chose to stand. Before snagging a beer from the refrigerator, I wiped the crumbs off the counter where they joined the dirt I had tracked in and leaned back against it. Riley's lips tightened, and she glanced at Larry, who didn't seem inclined to ask about my personal business. She tried asking with her eyes for a brief moment, but something about looking up at me spoiled the effect. She started to rise but hesitated. It was too obvious, and the moment was lost. Riley leaned back in her chair, pretending the bare wood felt comfortable against her non-padded backside. However, I was a witness. She was a marshal, and that required questions asked and answered. "Why did a movie start up on this computer when I walked up? And why did it keep changing movies until this one? Like it?" I asked. Before she answered, she glanced back at the monitor. The same movie still played. Her eyes held for a second, and her lips twitched. She liked it. Her fingers reached out and hit a key to lower the volume. I didn't like it. None of the keys were labeled volume. "Why does it change movies?" I nodded at the screen. "It's kind of a game. Do you like the movie it picked for you?" She showed her smile, and it was so good I almost forgot the badge and sidearm. Larry lowered his magazine. "Yeah, it's one of my favorites." "Something you programmed?" she casually asked, as if making conversation. "Something he taught," Larry corrected her. He rose to his feet illegally fast for an old guy, without using his hands or grunting. Riley had to crane her head upwards even further when she stepped over to the kitchen table. She slid her legs under her chair to get to her feet, but Larry had stepped in too close for her to get up without bumping into him. It was possible he didn't do it intentionally. Larry loved explaining technology he didn't understand. He looked down at Riley, grinned, and said, "You don't program this shit, Riley. You teach it." I winced and bit off a correction of my own. Train, teach. For Larry, it was close enough. It didn't matter, and there was no reason to spoil his moment. I drained my bottle in 2 long swallows, reached out an arm, pulled the refrigerator door open, and removed another beer. In many ways, it was the perfect house. I could prepare, cook, eat, and clean up my kitchen without moving more than 2 steps. Deputy Montoya looked up at him and brushed a strand of hair back from her eyes with her little finger. I felt my chest tighten, remembering Gabriella doing the same thing. Larry pointed to the screen. Nothing makes us feel more like men than explaining something to a woman. "It's artificial intelligence," he said, his voice patient, or, depending on your viewpoint, condescending. Riley's face clearly showed her perspective. Larry pointed at me. "He puts little artificial brains into the computer. They're just like ours, except they're empty." "So they're exactly like yours," Riley said. Beer shot out of my nose. Larry, an old-fashioned gentleman, waited for me to breathe normally again. Riley turned her face back to the silent movie, looking smug. Nothing makes a woman feel more like a woman than putting a man in his place. Rolling his eyes, he shrugged and continued. "Anyway, like I said, you don't program these brains, you teach them. Okay, they call it training, but I say you train dogs. And these little brains get a lot smarter than any dog." Larry was an 18-year-old Marine in Saigon the day it fell. He loved technology and had a hard time with remotes. But sometimes he surprised me. Riley pointed at my tower and asked, "So you taught a little brain in this to show me movies until it finds one I like? That's a big game computer, by the way. Didn't know you could still buy those." I said, "You can still buy them, but I built this one. As far as its little brain, some guys at Berkeley programmed it. I just used their little brains," enjoying how that sounded. Berkeley guys were a pain in the ass. "And it knows what I like how?" I motioned with the beer to the screen. "It watches your expression. That capability has been around for quite a while. Your smart TV does the same thing." "Come on, you hear that shit, but it's not real," Larry said. his eyes pleading as he thought about what we watched when alone. "Yeah, it's very real," I replied. "Why would someone do that?" he asked, almost in a whisper, probably remembering all of the things he had watched while alone in his room. "You can tell a lot from what movies someone watches night after night, especially if you know where they go and what they buy daily," I said, taking another swallow of beer. "And what we will buy next," Riley added. "No, to sell you what they want you to buy next," I corrected. Riley looked up at me with her large eyes and said, "Besides my taste in movies, what else is it trying to learn? Are you back in the business, Dale?" Her wide eyes suddenly narrowed, and my stomach clenched. I forced the side of my face that could relax to do so. Marshals weren't cops, or at least they didn't used to be. I felt drops of sweat run down my back.